Good morning, Morai Rabotai, Bruchim Abayim. We are continuing on Masechet Succah. We are on Daf Yud Gimel, Amud Bet, 17 lines up from the bottom of the Amud. Today's Amud is being learned as Zchut Refuah Shalema for Rachel Simcha Bat Nahid, for Nisim Bat Miriam, and for Esther Bracha Bat Chaya. That all should have full recovery. Refuah Shalema B'ezrat Hashem. Amen. This week's limud of the community has been dedicated graciously by the Shea family, Dayan family, Kohen families. Should be an ultimate zchut for all their mishpachot. B'ezrat Hashem. Amen. Okay, so we are amidst a discussion which got us really through some halachot of tum'ah v'tahara, of what is considered mekabel tum'ah as an addition and attachment to food, which is one of the three items that is mekabel tumah. So in other words, we mentioned that mideoraita, biblically speaking, there are three items that are mekabel tumah: adam, kelim, and ochel. But the Mishnayot in Masechet Uktzin tell us that also attachments to food sometimes are considered also mekabel tumah, aka oketz. Uktzin means the stem of the fruit or produce. And here we are discussing whether or not when you have a zemora shel anavim, a branch of wine that has in it the attachment of the grapes, is that considered mekabel tumah because of the attachment to food, and also the stem of your regular straw ending into a shibolet, into a not cluster, but a what's it called? The wheat, right? You have the produce on top, the wheat, the barley, and the stem of it, the straw. Is that considered something that kasher for sichuch? You could use it as schach, or maybe not. And the halacha would depend directly on this, whether or not the attachment makes it batel or does not make it batel. So we learned from two Talmidim of Rav Huna, Rav Abba, Rav Nashya, the two different halachot about this attachment and their nullification to one another. One is Rav Abba. Rav Abba said if you take branches of wine with a cluster of grape, that is not considered a problem, because if you take it for wine, you want to crush this and make wine out of it, not for schach, that is considered that you don't want the attachment to the grapes. You don't want it to be attached because you don't want the wood, the pieces of attachment to the grape to soak up some of your wine. You're losing wine. And also you don't want it to be mixed afterwards when you have it, so therefore you don't want it there. You want just the grapes as much as possible. So because you don't want it there, it's considered that it's no longer batel to the grapes, and hence it's not mekabel tumah. That is the halacha of Rav Abba. Rav Menashe says a different halacha. He says if you want schach, if you want to cut this shibolet of wheat, of barley, of your produce, but you really don't want the actual produce, you want the straw part of it because you want to make schach. That is no longer mekabel tumah, because now the straw is no longer batel, as usually it would be. Usually the straw has not much of a value, so when you cut it together with the produce, it is batel halachically to the produce, to the wheat, the barley, whatever it is. But here, you actually don't want the produce. You want the schach, you want the straw. And hence, says Rav Nasha, in the name of Rav Huna, that would be kasher for schach. The Gemara says, wait, why do you need to say both? And Gemara says, well, because one of them agrees to the other, but not vice versa. In other words, what we're going to read right now, Rav Abba, who says that when you cut your grapes for wine, you want to create wine, you want to crush them, juice them, and make your wine, that is when it's not considered mekabel tumah, because you really don't want it, right? Would he agree with the halacha of Rav Menashe for the schach, when you put the straws with the wheat together on top of the schach? Or would Rav Menashe agree with Rav Abba Rabbi Menashe who says, if you cut these bundles of wheat with the straw, you could drop it on top of your schach, no problem. Does he agree with Rab Abba? So Gemara says, yeah, of course he agrees with Rab Abba. The one who holds that you can cut the bundles of wheat and put it on top of your schach, and it's not mekabel tum'ah, because it is not batel, it is not nullified, the straw, to the food, to the grains of wheat and barley, he for sure would agree that when you cut your clusters of grape, the wood part is not nullified to the fruits because you absolutely don't want it to be there. No person that wants to make wine wants the wood to be there. You only want the grape. No sane person wants to lose the amount of wine that's going to be consumed by being soaked into the wood. You're losing. A smart businessman doesn't want to do that. And therefore, that is agreeable according to everyone. But the Gemara is going to say, we're saying it out loud, outside the Gemara, before we read it actually inside. Gemara is going to say, Rab Abba does not agree necessarily with Rab Menashe. Rab Abba who holds that by the case of winery, when you want to crush your grapes, in that case, your wood pieces of the cluster of grape is not nullified to your grapes, which means in the halachot of Tumah v'Tahara, if I am Tameh and I touch the wood, does the grape become Tameh or not, right? So Rab Abba said, if I cut this for crushing it to wine, no, it doesn't. If I touch the wood, nothing from the grape becomes Tameh. Or if the grape became Tameh and now the wood is touching something else, doesn't pass the Tumah. They're not nullified to one entity halachically. And the Gemara is going to say that person, Rab Abba, does not agree with the halacha of the schach for Rabbi Menashe. Why? Because Rabbi Menashe is saying a bigger chiddush than Rab Abba. Rabbi Menashe is saying that even though that I have this whole thing of wheat with the stem and the straw and the wheat on top, still the wheat does not make the whole thing mekabel tum'ah. Because I'm not doing it for the wheat. That's the chidush of Rabbi Menashe. Rabbi Abba says, wait a second, you really don't want it? I think you do. Because, you know what happens if you put this straw on top of the sukkah? Right? One little wind, and poof, the whole thing goes. Well, I'm saying it simply based on the simple understanding of Rashi. The Meiri really says you want it because you want the attachment for the wheat not to get lost. But be that as it may, either the straw you don't want it to get lost, or the wheat you don't want it to get lost, you want them to be together. You really do. So therefore, even though that your kavanah was that I'm cutting this off for the schach of my sukkah, you still kind of, in the back of your mind, want the attachment of the actual fruit there, so that we understand it to be a much bigger chiddush, much bigger novelty than the halacha of Rab Abba. Right? So the way it works is, Rab Menashe agrees with Rab Abba, but Rab Abba does not agree with Rab Menashe. That's how it works. Right? So two chidushim of the Gemara. So says the Gemara. Let's read this inside. Manda Amar Kotzer Kol Shken Boser. The one that holds that, which is Rab Menashe, that holds that Kotzer, when you cut off the grain with the stem and with the straw, is going to be tahor and it's kasher for schach. Kol sheken botzer. He would definitely agree with the halacha of Rab Abba that if you are cutting off your grapes for wine, that they're not going to be, the attachment of the wood pieces is not going to be mekabel tumah. But says the Gemara, because for sure, in the case of grapes, you don't want the wood to be there because you don't want it to suck up the wine, the remnants of the wine in the gat, and therefore diminish the amount of wine you get at the end. Nimser lechamre, man de amar botzer. But on the other hand, the one that holds botzer, which is Rab Abba, that holds by cutting the grapes and the cluster of anavim, the wood pieces are not nullified and hence not mekabel tum'ah. Says the Gemara, she'en lo yadot, which the wood piece is not considered a yad letum'ah, it's not attachment for being susceptible to tum'ah. Aval kotzer yesh lo yadot. He would argue with Rab Menasya, and he would say no, by the case of the bundles of wheat or barley, by produce, the straw actually is considered a yad letum'ah, because you want the attachment to be there. The nichale, because he is happy in the back of his mind. The lischach behu, you want to make your schach out of the straw attached to the actual wheat and barley, ki hechi delo li badran, because you don't want them to be spread out with a little wind. Again, either according to the simple understanding of Rashi, we're talking about the schach being blown away, or according to Meiri, you lose your actual wheat. You want them to stick together until after Sukkot. After Sukkot, you pick them up, and then you go and you use your produce. Whereas if you cut them off, then all the produce is going to get lost in the meantime. So says the Gemara, let us suggest that this machloket who erupted between two Talmidim of Rav Huna, which is now, we're talking about third generation of Amoraim. Maybe we could suggest that this is really a much older machloket that started already in the time of Tanaim. How so? Says the Gemara, the Tanya, we have a Braita. Sochet te'enim ubahen te'enim, parchilin ubahen anavim, kashin ubahen shibolim, mechabdot ubahen temarim. 4 different scenarios that you want to use it for schach. What are the cases? You take some fig tree, right? Nice wide leaves of a fig tree, right? So you cut the branches and it has figs in it, on it. And you want to dump it on top of your schach. Or the same thing with palm leaves. But you have actual temarim hanging from them. You have actual dates on. Or you have the zemorah shel anavim. You have branches of a vine. And you have actual clusters of grape hanging from it. Those 3, and then the produce. You're taking stems of wheat and barley, and the top of it actually has the shibolet of wheat and barley, and you want to put it on this. Mamash our case, right? And says the Braita, what's the halacha on this? Kasher or pasul? It's very interesting, because mamash we're talking about this in Talmidim of Rav Huna, and one says, I have a Braita. Let's discuss this in a Tanaic level. Says the Gemara, if you have more psolet, more wooden leaves than the actual food, then it's kasher. You remember we had this before in Daf Yud Aleph and Yud Bet, that you have a mixture of schach kasher and schach pasul. If you have more schach kasher, it's good to go, right? So that seems to be like pretty straightforward, classic halacha. Because everything is cut off from the ground. You just want to know, I have more wood and leaves over here than actual figs and barley and grapes and
But you could put it up
and dates, right?
You could put it up knowing you're going to have the intention of using it after.
Yeah, but you're cutting it up for schach. Now the question is, not started yet. Says, that's Rabbanan, right? Says the Gemara, Acherim Omrim, Acherim, who is normally a nickname for Rabbi Meir when he learned something from Elisha Acher. That's why Acherim comes from that. So Acherim Omrim, Ad sheyu kashin merubin al hayadot v'al ha'ochalin. It is not merely sufficient that you have more leaves than the fruits, but you have to have more leaves than the fruits plus the attachment to the fruits. So you have to have more leaves than the cluster of grapes with the wooden pieces attached to it. Because that also is considered halachically, says the Braita, like the fruit itself. So you see where we're going with this. Now you have Machloket Chachamim and Rabbi Meir here, Acherim, whether or not when I look at the food in terms of Mekabel Tum'ah for Schach on top of my Sukkah, whether I look at just the fruit itself or do I look at the attachment as well. Right? Now, what did we say before we go through the Gemara? Before we get into this whole fight, what did we say before this? We said that Rabbi Menasya, right, is the one that says if you cut it for schach, you're good to go. There's no yadot, there's no handles over here. Because my mind determines that this is not a yad anymore. I want this for schach, I don't want it to be a yad. That's what we said, right?
Yeah.
And we mentioned that Rav Huna's other Talmid, Rab Abba, disagrees with that. It says the fact that you cut it for schach, you still in the back of your mind want the handles to be attached to the actual wheat and barley, so therefore that's no good. That's what we had before we got to this Braita, right? Now that we read this Braita, wait a second, what exactly happens? We have a machloket, right? Acherim say that the handles are still considered handles, and Chachamim say no, they're not considered handles. Just the fruit is bad. The rest is good, right? So I would want to say that Chachamim are like Rabbi Menasya, right? And Acherim is like Rab Abba. That's what I would want to say, right? So says the Gemara. So, in other words, we just found that our machloket, Rabbi Menasya and Rab Abba, is machloket Tanaim, Rabbi Meir, Acherim, and Rabbanan. Which is amazing, right? We always want to do that. We always want to diminish and minimize machloket and attach them to machlokets that have always existed before we don't want to create new machloket. So says the Gemara, why wouldn't we say that machloket Chachamim and Acherim is exactly this? The more savar yesh lahen yadot, that one of them, which is Acherim, Rabbi Meir, holds that there is yadot, even though that I cut it off from the ground in order to put it on my schach, still is considered yadot, which would be exactly like Rav Abba. Umor savar en lahem yadot, and the other one holds en lahem yadot. Acherim holds that it's yadot, and Chachamim hold there is no yadot. Amazing. So says the Gemara, not so simple. It's not as straightforward as we presented it, because let's take a look. Le Rabbi Abba vadai Tanai. According to Rabbi Abba, for sure this is machloket Tanaim. In other words, Rabbi Abba would tell you what I am telling you is machloket Tanaim. I cannot survive according to everyone. What I tell you that I disagree with Rabbi Menasya, that when you take this wheat with this stem, that I hold this pasul, I cannot survive according to Chachamim. I only could survive according to Rabbi Meir. I hold like Rabbi Meir, right? Because Chachamim clearly black and white in the Braita say that even if I cut the whole branch of wine or dates or te'anim, it's kasher. And you don't need, there's no yadot. So they disagree with me. They're for sure like Rabbi Menasya. I, who disagree with Rabbi Menasya, I only could survive according to Rabbi Meir. So according to me, my machloket with Rabbi Menasya is machloket Tanaim. If you would ask, Rabbi Abba, right? But Rabbi Menasya, says the Gemara, could survive according to everyone. Rabbi says, well, ma pitom. Well, I should be only according to Rabbanan, not Rabbi Meir. I think Rabbi Meir would agree with me too. Everybody agrees with me, right? So Rabbi Menasya would say, what I'm saying is according to everyone. Machloket Rabbi Meir, Acherim and Chachamim, let it be. That has nothing to do with me. what I say is true according to Rabbi Meir, Acherim, according to Chachamim, according to everybody. How so? Says the Gemara. The Rab Menasya bar Gadya mile matanai. According to Rab Menasya bar Gadya, that this discussion that he has with Rab Abba is not necessarily machlok. Let us say that's machlok tanai. Amar lecha Rab Menasya. Rab Menasya would say the kule alma savri. Everybody agrees with my halacha that hakotzer leschach en lo yadot. Everybody agrees with what I say. That if you go to your field and you cut up something thinking that I am putting this on top of my sukkah, it is kasher. There's no yadot. Yeah, the fruits are tameh, that's for sure, right? But take the fruits out and the rest, the attachments, the fruit kasher. They're not yadot. How do I explain machloket chachamim and acherim and Rabbi Meir? In other words, in the machloket tanaim that we just learned, which says that Rabbi Meir holds that still is considered yadot. How do I reconcile that Rabbi Meir agrees with me? Because we have two people, right? We have Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Nasya, a Tana and a Amora. Rabbi Nasya says, if I cut this thinking of my schach, kasher. Rabbi Meir says, no, all the yadot are still considered makabel tum'ah. So how does Rabbi Menashe explain that that still works according to me? Listen to the genius here. You ready? Says Rabbi Menashe, you know what Rabbi Meir is speaking about? The nimlach alehen lesichuch. Rabbi Meir is not talking about the case that you went to the field and you said, I want some schach. Rabbi Meir is talking about the case that you went to the field and he said, you know what, my wine has grown too much. I'm going to do some pruning. And, of course, there's some grape clusters there. I'm going to use them. I'm going to eat them and make wine and have them served at the dessert reception. Right? So you cut all these branches of wine for food, which in that moment, it makes all of the attachments yadot letumah, right? But then you came home and your wife said, awesome, this week Wednesday is Erev Sukkot. You know what we should do? It's actually very nice. Just put everything on top of the schach, and you say, oh, gee, right, you're right, right? So you changed your mind. You originally cut them for food, and then you changed your mind. You said, you know what? You're supposed to listen to your wife always, right? I'm going to put it as a schach. So that change of mindset, does that change the status of mekabel tum'ah, of being susceptible to tum'ah or not? You hear a case. I cut this down. The action of cutting it, detaching it from ground, was almenat la'achila. I was the mindset of mekabel tum'ah, which is for eating, is mekabel tum'ah. Then I changed my mind. I want now to consider this as schach. Does that switch the halachot of mekabel tum'ah by this item or not? So says Rab Menashe, listen to this. You with me? Says the Gemara, you cut them down for food and then you change your mind to use them for schach. So says the Gemara, that's basic. If you cut them down for food, why is Rabbanan mekel? So now we understand why Rabbi Meir is machmir. Rabbi Meir says, well, you cut it up in the beginning. Your action was made this susceptible to tumah. Once it becomes susceptible to tumah, it does not evaporate this status. So once it's fine, very good. So what's the svara of Chachamim? Chachamim still say, argue with Rabbi Meir. Whatever you're going to say the scenario is, you have to maintain that this machloket the Chachamim and Rabbi Meir. So why in the world would Chachamim still be mekel if you cut it down originally for food? So says the Gemara, and if you want to say, if you want to suggest, if you want to suggest, don't suggest that. If you want to suggest that you could just switch like this on a whim, that you cut it for food and then you just change your mind and it changes the status. Doesn't change the status like that. You know why? You could just like this switch your mindset and you'll switch the halakha. You can't. We learned, and this is one of the most known Mishnayot in Masechet Kelim. It's Perek Chaf Hey, Mishnah Tet. It's brought in multiple places in Shas, and it's multiple sugyot, the halacha, that need this and use this. Kol HaKelim, Yordin Lidet Tum'ah B'machshava. All of the vessels, the kelim, they become susceptible to tum'ah with your machshava, when you think of them as a kli. But once they go down to that level of being susceptible to tum'ah, galak, taking him out of that status, they do not come out of being that status of mekabel tum'ah with just mere thought. It doesn't work like that. Ve'en olin mitumatan ela beshinui maaseh. If you want to change their status and make them no longer mekabel tum'ah, you have to do something to them. You need maaseh. Machshava, just thought, does not work. So you're telling me that Chachamim hold, you cut this down in order to eat it as food, it became mekabel tum'ah, and then 5 minutes later you just flip-flop and you said, it's chach, and then it's good to go. No, it's not. Once it becomes susceptible to tum'ah, it's a Mishnah in Masechet Kelim that says once something becomes susceptible to tum'ah, you cannot change the status without an actual doing, without maaseh. With thought, you cannot change it. Says the Gemara, Maaseh motzi miyad maaseh, umiyad machshava. Machshava ena motzia, lo miyad maaseh, velo miyad machshava. Once you have a status of mekabel tum'ah, a thought process does not take it out of being mekabel tum'ah. And if you want to say, the Gemara is doing the whole work. It says, don't tell me this and don't tell me that, right? You're stuck with this understanding of Chachamim. Why in the world would Chachamim be mekel if you cut down the tree, the branches, for food and then you changed your mind? Why in the world would they be mekel? And don't tell me, says the Gemara, that food branches, right, yadot, Masechet Uktzin, is different than kelim. In other words, the Gemara says maybe you're thinking to answer that that's for a keli. When you have an actual vessel, vessels, kelim midoraita dar mekabel tumah, right? We said adam, keli, and ochel, right? The chupchiks, the attachments to the food, it's masechet uktzin. That's an addition. It's not a real keli. So maybe you want to attempt to answer that that's the difference between a keli and an okitz. That a kli, a real vessel, once you think of it as a keli, you can no longer take it out of being susceptible to tum'ah with just thought. You need maaseh. But an okitz, a little attachment to the fruit, maybe that's different. Maybe that I could switch it on, with a thought. I think of it to become a kabel tumah, becomes kabel tumah. I change my thought and I think it to be now schach for my sukkah, it becomes now. Maybe that works. Maybe it's different than kelim. Maybe you should not be bringing this mishnayot in Masechet Kelim Perek Chaf Hey Mishnah Tet. Maybe it's not the same. By okitz, by a little attachment compared to an actual keli. And if you want to tell me that, says the Gemara, if you want to tell me that keli is different, the chashivi, because a keli is chashuv, it's important, it's something of significance. But the oketz, aval yadot de lesorach achilaninu, yadot is just there to hold the fruit and eat it. That's why it's nullified. It's not a real keli. So maybe that has a different halacha, and b'machshava naasa, or b'machshava salka, that you could take it, make it susceptible to tum'ah with your machshava, and you could take it out of that susception to tum'ah also with your machshava. Gemara says, don't think that. Why? Because we learned in a Mishnah. V'hatanan, we have a Mishnah, kol yadot ha'ochalin shebesasan begoren tehorot. Now this is a very interesting Mishnah. I'm afraid we're not going to be able to finish this, but the Gemara is going to bring this very topic that we just started. When you have yadot, when you have attachments of food, can you flip-flop in your machshava and make them one way this minute and then change your mind next minute and their halakha status will change? Can you do that or not? It's actually a Mishnah. And the Gemara is going to bring this Mishnah, discuss it, and then basically that we have just a few lines left to this fantastic sugya that we started in the halachot of Tumah v'Tahara, ending with a fantastic piece of Musar and Agata in the Tefillah of Tzadikim, which actually is this week's parasha of the Tzadikim being barren and Hashem wanting their Tefillah, which Hashem will continue and we'll learn tomorrow morning. Chazak u'baruch.